Hello, everyone. It's nice to see all of you. So thank you for coming to the School of Journalism and Media's 2024 Mary Alice Davis Lecture. I want to give a special thank you to the school staff for all the work they've put in to organize this event. It's always a lot of work each year, and I really appreciate their help. And of course, a big thank you to the Davis family for their continued support of this event. The Mary Alice Davis Lecture was established in 2005, which means we have a big anniversary coming up next year. By the Davis family to honor Mary Alice, a longtime columnist and editorial writer for the Austin American-Statesman. Mary Alice was an extraordinary journalist who won many national and state journalism awards. One of her signature achievements was to crusade for the Children's Health Insurance Program in the state of Texas. She wrote editorial after editorial in those years and was a major driver behind the passage of that legislation. Mary Alice earned a bachelor's degree in journalism at UT Austin, where she met her husband, Jim, and was hired in 1966 as the first female night copy editor at the Corpus Christi Caller-Times. Throughout her career, Mary Alice was a champion of women journalists in Texas, and after retirement, she helped to found the Texas Women Coalition. She would be proud of our Mary Alice Davis lecturer this evening, Loren Grush. Loren is a 2010 graduate of the school. After graduation, she worked as a health editor and writer in New York City for Fox News. She then moved on to The Verge, a technology-focused news site, where she started as a senior science reporter and then became the site's space reporter. Loren was prepared for this role from her early years. She grew up at NASA in Houston with two NASA engineers as parents. Loren stayed at The Verge for 7 years, eventually hosting her own online video series called Spacecraft, a show that examined what it takes to send people into the cosmos. She made the leap to Bloomberg News as its space reporter in 2022, and there she covers everything from NASA to human spaceflight and the booming commercial space industry. It's just lots of interesting anecdotes about Elon Musk. Loren's work has appeared at the New York Times, Popular Science, Nautilus Magazine, Digital Trends, and many other publications. In 2023, she published a book called The Six that recounts the true story of America's first female astronauts in the 1980s. The New York Times review of Loren's book observes, "It's difficult to imagine a place more coded as masculine than the cockpit of a rocket ship." Well, I can imagine one such place, the American newspaper newsroom that Mary Alice entered in the 1960s. Like the cockpit, the newsroom of the 1960s was widely understood to be a place for men to inhabit, to compete, and to define the news. Another review notes that women have been included in every astronaut class since 1978. The same is true of newsrooms. Mary Alice was part of a generation of women who opened up newsrooms in the 1960s and 1970s, and today there are as many women in newsrooms as men. In both of these cases, early cohorts of women pushed forward out of desire, a desire to achieve their personal dreams, a desire to do things that were once forbidden to them, a desire to make a difference. In The Six, Loren so eloquently writes, made a difference. Mary Alice did too. We can see that difference in Loren herself. We're so happy to welcome her as our Mary Alice Davis lecturer this year. Please help me welcome her to the stage.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I'm so happy to be back here at my alma mater, University of Texas. I also want to thank you all for coming out today. Y'all are very brave for doing so. But I think it actually is very timely because as we're going to explore, what we went through yesterday is going to be very relevant for space in the years ahead. So I thought I'd start off on a lighter tone, just kind of give you a rundown of how I got to be a space reporter, because that is a question that I get asked pretty frequently. So I always like to say that NASA is in my blood, whether I like it or not. So this is a picture of the crew of an early shuttle flight STS-41G. And if you see there, that's Sally Ride, who some of you may know as the first American woman in space. And then right next to her is my mother, who looks quite young in this picture. I think this was, 1984, I want to say. Many moons ago. She just started fresh out of college. And that's her working on the refueling satellite experiment that I didn't point to it, but that's Kathy Sullivan, whose back is turned to us. She became the first American woman to perform a spacewalk, and she would go on to perform that experiment that my mother worked on. And then this is my dad. I don't have a cool picture of him with any famous astronauts, but I do love this picture because it's just very 80s, and that is, that's who my mother fell for back when they met at NASA. And so, yes, if it weren't for the space program, I would not be here. They met at NASA's Johnson Space Center, fell in love, and had me. And this is an overview or an aerial shot of JSC. And I grew up right next door to this. So I don't know how many of you are from the Houston area, but I grew up in a little town called Friendswood, Texas. It's a suburb right next door to Clear Lake, which is the surrounding area for JSC. And I think as it was said in my introduction, I was surrounded by space, the space shuttles, astronauts, at the dinner table. It was very typical to hear about my mom's subsystems, so hydraulic systems and water spray boilers, and it all went over my head at the time, but that was very normal for me. And it was also very normal for everyone in my community. So being next door to Johnson Space Center, it wasn't abnormal for kids like me to have parents who worked in the space program. It was very ubiquitous. And so none of us actually found it to be quite unique. Instead, it was, oh, your parents work at JSC, so do mine. Let's move on, let's go hang out. But I did, as someone who did grow up next to JSC and with parents who worked in the space program, I definitely had some interesting childhood experiences. This is a photo from our NASA summer camp when I was a kid, and there's little me. I don't even know what that outfit is I'm wearing, but Anyway, so because I grew up in a community where space was all around us, I actually rejected space when I was growing up. So I'm sure, many of you are students, you're probably still teenagers. And when you're a teenager, not always do you think what your parents do is particularly cool. And so there was definitely a time when I was growing up where my parents would have loved if I had gone into engineering. And while I did love math and science growing up, I really didn't want anything to do with space because I just thought it was the most uncool thing one could do. And so I really gravitated more towards storytelling. So whenever there was a class project or anything like that at school, I was definitely the one with a camcorder in my hand. Gosh, an early 2000s camcorder too. I know I'm aging myself now, but yeah, and so I would always put together video projects. I loved theater. I was a big theater kid growing up, so I very much gravitated towards creativity and the arts. And so that's why when I came to UT, I decided to go into broadcast journalism. And I just, this is my time to tout how much I loved my time at the University of Texas. There's just a great journalism school here. And I really tried to do it all when I was here. So one of the main things that I was a part, while I did my broadcast journalism sequence, which is the set, I don't know if the set looks the same now, but that's what the set looked like when I was reporting and broadcasting there. Also up in the right-hand corner is me with a headset producing one of the shows that I worked on at Texas Student Television. So I was the producer of Sneak Peek, which was an entertainment news show, and I would go on to be the entertainment director for all of TSTV. And I really loved that. That was a great experience. It really gave me early hands-on experience with equipment, how to put together packages, how to write for TV broadcast, and it also helped me make some of the friends that I still call friends to this day. And then I don't believe this is still a thing anymore, but one of the things that was started when I was at UT was this thing called ABC News on Campus. And what that program was a series of bureaus that they put throughout colleges throughout the country. And they had one here at UT. I don't think it exists anymore, but I was one of the reporters for this program, and so I got to go on to our local affiliates here in Austin and do some reports. And this is me and my my most, I think it was, well, I considered it my most grown-up dress at the time, and doing my best impression of a experienced reporter. But one thing I will say is coming to UT did a lot for me in terms of, honing my skills and my experience. But another thing that it helped me was to give me a newfound perspective on how I grew up. So as I mentioned earlier, growing up outside of JSC, space was all around us, but it was really coming here, even just 3 hours outside of Houston, and that I really started to learn how unique and special my childhood was. So I would tell people that I met here that my parents worked for NASA growing up, and that I had grown up next door to the Space Center, and their eyes would light up as I would tell them that, and it really just gave me this new sense of, this might seem normal and regular for me, but for other people that didn't grow up with this is actually something I should really not take for granted. And so over time, as the farther I moved away from Houston, the more I realized that I really did grow up with something unique and great. And so that ultimately, when I left for New York, so after I graduated, I moved to New York to pursue a career in journalism. And I thought, I wonder if this childhood of mine and this unique experience of mine could actually be parlayed into a career. And so when it came time to pick the stories that I wanted to write and the beats that I wanted to focus on, I started to think, I wonder if I could get someone to hire me to write about space for a living. And so over time, I just started taking more and more assignments and voicing my opinions that I wanted to write about space. And ultimately, one day, The Verge came a-calling, and so I remember that day very clearly. They put out an ad for someone who wanted to write about NASA and the commercial space industry, and they had to be very passionate about it, but also not reticent to critique it. And I just remember thinking, oh, they want me to come work for them. So I applied for the job, and I didn't hear from them for a month and a half afterward, which was really fun. But then they called me and said that we want you for the job, and I did not quit journalism, thankfully. And I love this picture because they really try their best to show that that I am the space reporter. If you can see the NASA logo on the book that I am holding, and the cheesy grin on my face. But at The Verge, I'm so thankful for my time at The Verge. I spent 7 years there, and that's really where I honed my craft. I threw myself into the space beat, and made a lot of mistakes along the way. But over time, as I did it more and more often, I really became much more comfortable reporting on it, and I really got to experience all sorts of types of storytelling. So one of the things that The Verge, I think, did really well is great video storytelling. This is me in front of a mock-up of SpaceX's Dragon capsule at their headquarters in Hawthorne, California. And I will bring it back to my time at UT. One thing that I think was really impressive for The Verge was that I told them I wanted to be on camera, and that I felt like I was very comfortable on camera because I had had that experience through the broadcast journalism program here at UT. And so the great thing about The Verge is they kept saying yes to all of the things that I wanted to do. And so anytime I wanted to do video, if they had the budget for it, they would say yes for it. And so I got to have a lot of great experiences, including going on the so-called Vomit Comet. So this is, I don't know if anyone's familiar with this, but it's a special type of plane called, it's nicknamed the Vomit Comet. I think you can understand why. But it does parabolic flight. So what it will do is it will fly in these parabolas, simulating free fall and zero-G. And we got to, you can see the GoPro in my hand. I'm trying to get kind of a first-person view of what I was experiencing. But we made a whole video about it. And I had, unfortunately, my coworker can't be seen. She's the one behind the camera, but we got to film a whole great video about what's it like to experience this. And so I really got a lot of great opportunities. And actually, this video was part of, I think what David was mentioning earlier was my own online show that we created called Spacecraft. I came up with that name, and I think it's amazing. And it was a great look into, what it takes for people to train for space. And so getting to do that was such an honor and really great for me. And then another thing that, being on camera has helped me with is being a so-called expert. I can say I'm an expert. An expert when, news breaks on the space beat. And so a lot of the times, this is a great example. Recently, United Airlines was one of the first big airline providers to adopt Starlink Wi-Fi on their fleet of aircraft. And so whenever the news anchors want to talk about that, they'll come calling to me and they'll say, okay, Loren, we need to explain, why is this important? Give us the context. And because I've been writing about these things, for so long, it's easy for me to kind of explain that pretty quickly in 5-second sound bites. And again, just reiterating how helpful UT was in preparing me for these kinds of moments. And also to move quite along, 2 years ago, I did get a job reporting on the space beat for Bloomberg, and I've been there ever since. Would you believe it? They have an Austin office. So I thought I was going to be reporting remotely full-time, but they have an office here in Austin. Come by, we'll have coffee sometime. And yeah, it's actually been really a great experience working on Bloomberg because Bloomberg has recognized how important space is becoming as a beat, and we are actually really growing out our space team. So typically, most publications have always had just one reporter working on space. That was how it was for me at The Verge. But now we're recognizing that, it's becoming a much more important beat than ever before. And so now I have a whole team of folks from reporters and editors working with me on this beat. And I think we're doing some of the best work in the field today. And then, as mentioned, I also published my first book called The Six last year. It came out in paperback this past month. And yes, it's about the first 6 women astronauts at NASA. And I won't spend too much time on it, but I just want to say this was such a dream come true for me because one of the things that I really care about being a space reporter is elevating women's stories in the space industry. One thing I've definitely learned while being on this beat for the last decade is that we still have quite a long way to go when it comes to reaching parity in terms of men and women in the industry, men and women going to space. And so it was really important to me that when I wrote my first book that I put women front and center. And I could not have asked for a better group of women to write about than these women just because they all have such fascinating lives and fascinating resumes. And their space flights were just a breeze to write about. And so that's always going to be a passion of mine moving forward, is making sure that I try to find more women to talk about space because I think that is absolutely necessary. So now I'll move on to a little bit about kind of what space reporting is. I guess that is why you all are here. So I always like to say that space reporting is 10 beats in one. And I think that this is a good illustration of just kind of how diverse space reporting can be. So I don't know how many of you have been following SpaceX's development of Starship right here in Texas, but the company has been developing a massive, in fact, the most massive and the most powerful rocket ever developed on the southern tip of Texas. And one of the amazing parts of covering space is getting to follow their test flights. One thing SpaceX likes to do is to test things until they break, and so they can be very exciting moments to follow. And so I've been covering the development of Starship down in Texas. Sometimes I go down there, which is nice to be in Austin. And then also, there's space science. So here's an animation from NASA of a supermassive black hole and how its mass is warping the space and time around it. And that's just as much about space journalism as the Starship rocket is. There's space science, so new discoveries about, supernovae or colliding galaxies or new discoveries in the Milky Way. That is just as much about space as it is as anything else. And ultimately, when I first started on the beat, I was doing all of this. I was doing the SpaceX side of things, and I was doing the discovery side of things. One of the big things that I covered when I was at The Verge was the first detection of gravitational waves. I don't know if any of you guys remember that, but that was huge for the space science community because they'd been trying to detect them for a really long time, and they're very sensitive, so it was really difficult to actually detect them. But these waves are actually ripples in space-time that we can actually find here on Earth, and so that was an amazing moment to cover. And then also space reporting looks like this. So really boring committee hearings with the NASA administrator. This is NASA Administrator Bill Nelson. We'll see if he's the NASA administrator for much longer. We'll find that out soon, I'm sure. But yes, a lot of it is, politics and people advocating for the various policies that they want to see play out in space. That can be regulation, that can be various missions that want to be covered. And a lot of times it's just listening to people drone on and on in, very beige chambers. But that is just as much space reporting as all of the other exciting stuff that I talked about. And speaking of the 10 beats in one, I mean, this, I think, I felt like I could come up with a whole list more than this of what space reporting is. It's science, it's business, the commercialization of space is really making a lot of space reporters into finance reporters, and that's great, being at Bloomberg, because we have a lot of reporting on that already, but it really has become more of a business-minded beat than it ever was before. Also, labor reporting. One thing I like to say is that, when it comes to space, like, it's made up of people. Like, we might think that space is just, far away and not anything that touches us, but the people that explore space are just as important a part of the story as they are about the discoveries that they make. Technology, investigative reporting, health reporting. How does the space environment affect the human body? One of the things that we're trying to do is send humans into space for longer than ever before. And, the human body really did not evolve to live in space. And so there are all sorts of different problems that arise when you are in the microgravity environment for a really long time. And it's important for us to stay on top of that. Environmental reporting. So how do rockets and space travel actually impact the world around us? How do satellites impact the world around us? How do satellites impact the orbit around Earth? That is just as important to talk about as well. And then data. Obviously that's a crucial part of any reporting, especially when it comes to space in terms of, how many things are we launching? How big is the debris cloud getting in the environment around us? All of that is really crucial. Also, another thing I'll talk about is there are kind of different space reporters, right? So I mentioned earlier that when I was at The Verge, I did it all. I did science, I did NASA, I did commercial. Now I'm much more focused on the business side of things, being a Bloomberg reporter, but you'll see a lot of people who are much more focused on space science, much more focused on NASA, on politics. So there really is, you can find your niche within the space beat as well. Another thing I'll also talk about is the P in the room, politics. So obviously when it comes to today and what happened yesterday, we're already starting to think about how space is going to be impacted by the election. So, I think everyone's probably been following this one pretty closely. The SpaceX CEO Elon Musk has been very involved in this election. And so now we're starting to ask the questions, okay, what does that mean? So obviously, Elon made a big bet on being allied with President Trump. So what does that mean? What is he going to get out of it? What are the kinds of things that he's going to advocate for? There's been talk of Elon being a member of, not the cabinet, but maybe some kind of advisor. What does that mean for his space companies? We're all starting to ask those questions right now. And so, one thing I always like to point out is that space and science are just as political as any other beat that you might more associate with politics. All right, so I picked this lovely picture of the UT Longhorn cheerleaders, but it does illustrate a point. So one of the best pieces of advice that I got when I started on the space beat is not to be a cheerleader. So I think there's a tendency when it comes to space for people to really advocate for it because, it is an aspirational beat, right? going to space is kind of the pinnacle achievement of what humans can do. Therefore, it's this lofty goal, and everything about it is so great and amazing, and look at what we can do in space. But as I mentioned before, the space industry is made up of people, and people are fallible. And so just as people reporting on the tech sector have to be vigilant about how the companies within their industry are behaving, it's the same for the space industry. We don't get a waiver, or space companies don't get a waiver just because they are working on these lofty goals. They're a company just like any other, and they also have to grapple with issues of discrimination, sexual harassment, burnout, all sorts of things that anyone else in various industries have to deal with this too. Additionally, NASA is a taxpayer-funded agency, and so what they do, is supposedly supposed to reflect on what the United States wants. And also, how are they using that money? Are they using it appropriately? Are they procuring things appropriately? That's a question that we're definitely going to be asking, as we move forward too. So I always say that it's really important to be just as critical and dive deep when you're a space reporter than you would in any other beat, even if it is something that you think is amazing and great. And so here are just a few headlines that I've written to kind of illustrate that point. For instance, the Starship, whenever they do these Starship launches down in Texas, I always like to remind people of kind of what the laundry list of things look like. In fact, same with NASA, the daunting to-do list that they have for sending people back to the moon. They're always talking about how we're going to do these amazing things, but I think it's our job as reporters to remind folks of just what the steps take to get to that point, because I think we hear the end goal, but we're not always being told about what has to be done to get there. Again, like I mentioned, about being a labor reporter. We spent a long time talking to former employees at SpaceX about what the culture is like at SpaceX. And I think that is just as important a story to tell as it is telling their accomplishments. This is actually pretty real time. I just broke this story last week. Again, this was a company, Relativity, that made a lot of bold promises, and that's very big in the space world, is making big claims that they're going to be able to do this, raising lots of money. And now by talking to folks behind the scenes, we actually realize that they're now low on funds, and they're really going to have to figure out some kind of new funding option to move forward. Another example is, back when the pandemic was starting, I was getting word from a lot of employees at Blue Origin that they were being pressured to travel. And I don't know if you guys remember back at the beginning of the pandemic, nobody wanted to leave their house. I know I didn't. And so I spent a lot of time talking to them and broke the story there. And then again, another environmental story, why it's time to study how rocket emissions change the atmosphere. That I think is something that people don't talk about enough either, but more and more we're launching, hundreds of rockets into space, and it's only going to increase with time each year. And so it's important to kind of start asking these questions about what it means for us here on Earth. And another great example that I like is never trust a launch date. So I think this is a really good illustration of just why you have to be critical of the space beat. In fact, actually just published this story today. So we're talking, real time, folks. One thing that Elon has been proclaiming lately is that a President Trump win would mean that we would reach Mars much sooner. His whole thing is that, we're going to have less regulation under a Trump presidency, therefore we're going to be able to make it to Mars because the regulatory burden that SpaceX has had to deal with from the likes of the FAA and the FCC are really what's holding us back. And so he predicts we're going to be sending uncrewed flights to Mars in 2 years, with humans sending them there in 2028. And so, I hammer home on this point a lot, but I do think it bears repeating just to remind people of just how hard it's going to be to send humans to Mars. And people like to throw out launch dates all the time. Elon especially, his are rarely ever rooted in reality. And it's just important to remind people, exactly why these things are said and why they are valuable. They generate hype and they can be used as currency to get contracts and things like that. And it also does, lead to a high pressure environment within his company. So I think that's just a good example of not being a cheerleader, making sure that you provide valuable context for a lot of these lofty claims that people are constantly making. And so that ultimately leads me to the access dilemma. Yes, this is me and Elon. I did not Photoshop it. This is me interviewing him at the debut of the Falcon Heavy rocket launch. And so, when I first started on this beat, my boss told me that getting an interview with Elon should be my top priority. And I definitely was, thinking at the time, okay, I don't remember if he was the richest man in the world at the time, but it was definitely a lofty goal. He was by far a billionaire and also somewhat elusive to pin down. And so I ultimately was able to, after enough time working in this industry, pinging the right people and writing about it, that I was able to secure this interview ahead of the Falcon Heavy launch. And so there was a time when I was really riding high. I was like, oh, I've achieved it. I've done it. And then a few years later, I wrote something he didn't like, and he blocked me on Twitter. And I remember at the time that I started freaking out because I thought, well, if anyone follows Elon, especially space-minded folks, he is essentially SpaceX's PR firm at the moment. While they do have their own comms folks, he is the one that's predominantly making headlines with what SpaceX is working on, what they're doing. He'll constantly update folks with, oh, the rocket suffered this issue, or we're going to launch on this date, yada, yada, yada. And so I was thinking, oh, I am going to fail at my job because I can't, it's going to be much harder for me to see Elon's work. They're not going to give me the time of day anymore. And so I went through a kind of whole existential crisis about it. And I think this is honestly something that a lot of reporters have to deal with, especially in the space beat, because it is a very access-driven beat, unfortunately. Especially more and more now as there are more companies entering the fray. One thing that's in NASA's charter is that they have to disseminate what they're doing as widely as possible. So NASA does have kind of a mandate to talk to the press. I could spend another hour on whether or not they do that. But they do have this obligation to talk to us. SpaceX and these companies do not. And as has been demonstrated, because SpaceX has just kind of cut off reporters when it comes to getting comments. So anytime we reach out for comment from SpaceX, we usually don't hear back. It's very rare that we get any kind of word back. And so over time, after I did get blocked, I started to realize that this was actually an opportunity. Because I think when it comes to access, and I'm sure you guys learned this in your journalism school and in your classes, it's a double-edged sword, right? Because when getting access is always great and getting more information is great, but there is the thought in the back of your head that if you write something bad, you will lose that access. And that should not be the motivator of why you write a story. You should write a story because it is correct, it is the truth, and it is telling an important story. And I think there's a trap that a lot of reporters can feel themselves getting into sometimes, is debating whether or not they want to write something because it might cut off that access. But what I learned in getting that access cut off is that it's actually an opportunity to be more creative and to talk with people that aren't just touting the company line, because think about what Elon is saying when he talks to the press, or when he talks publicly. He's trying to tout what is best for SpaceX. But if you want to learn, what is actually going on, sometimes you have to be creative and talk to people who aren't just talking publicly. And so this is something that I think it's tough with space reporting specifically because of the commercialization of space, getting access to launch pads like this, you need access from the companies, you need access from NASA or the Space Force. Again, they're not supposed to deny you based on what you write, but there is always that conundrum. And so I just always like to tell people, and another piece of advice I got from another boss was that, access can be poison in a way. So just remember that we shouldn't be writing with that, and we should be writing what, is a good story and what needs to be told. And then lastly, I'll just say that, it's just such an exciting time to write about space. As I mentioned, space is it's such a different beat than it was when I was a kid. I naively thought that when I started on the space beat that my parents and my background was going to give me this leg up in some way, that I knew everything there was to know about space because I grew up in it, I was next door to the Space Center, and the truth is I knew absolutely nothing. When my parents were in the space program, it was a completely different time. They worked primarily on the space shuttle, and that was really the only game in town. NASA was in complete control of access to space. They oversaw the development of all the rockets. They operated all the rockets, and there really was not a very vibrant commercial space industry. Now, fast forward to my time, and there is just a wide and diverse array of commercial space companies that are all trying to get to space. These are just a few examples of some of the things that I cover. I really got to witness the rise of SpaceX while I've been a space reporter. I started reporting on this beat about in 2014, and they hadn't even landed a rocket yet. And so I remember back when we first started reporting on SpaceX's reusable rockets, we covered every single launch that they did. And that makes me giggle now because they are launching, they probably launched a rocket while I've been up here, let's be honest. Actually, I think they might have. Yeah, those first few landings were breaking news. I mean, I was covering that first landing, I think, at my friend's Christmas party in the corner of the room, because that's another thing about space. Holidays matter not at all. They will launch whenever is most inconvenient for you. And now, I mean, I don't even bat an eye when they launch anymore, because otherwise I would never get any sleep, because they are launching at all hours of the night, landing at all hours of the night. And that is just, the way that this world has evolved so quickly. Another thing that I like to point out is this third frame here. Did anyone remember the stuck astronauts on the space station? Yes. So that was I've been following that program that Boeing has been a part of since its inception, really. Well, since they first got their contract. And so, that's a great example of how NASA has been evolving since I've been on the beat. NASA is really trying more to be less of the overseer and less of the one operating the vehicles, and partnering more with the private sector. And what we saw with this commercial crew program, which the Boeing capsule was a part of, is kind of both the risk and the reward of doing so. So having partnered with SpaceX, SpaceX has really become the backbone of our space program these days, because they are the ones that are the only company capable of launching astronauts to and from the International Space Station. Russia can do it, but we very much wanted a U.S. option, a U.S.-led option. And so they really showed the success that NASA could have when partnering with the commercial space industry. And then Boeing, unfortunately, has shown the downfalls of it, right? I mean, they very well could come back. We're still kind of waiting to see how NASA plans to move forward with Boeing. But that is kind of, one of the risks that they took while making this bet. And then also, I pointed to the Artemis program. The Artemis program is NASA's program to send humans back to the moon. Part of that is awarding commercial companies with contracts to create landers to land on the moon. And they're more and more using these commercial partnerships like they did with SpaceX and Boeing to get back to the moon. And so it really is a fascinating time to be covering this industry because we're watching NASA evolve to become something different than they used to be. And we're watching the space industry really kind of, move leaps and bounds than I think I ever thought possible. And so that is just, it really opens the door to all sorts of different stories that we can tell and that really illustrate, why space is such an important beat to talk about right now. This is a picture of a stack of Starlink satellites. So for those who don't know, Starlink is SpaceX's internet constellation that's orbiting overhead right now. SpaceX is the owner and operator of the largest constellation or network or system of satellites in low Earth orbit at this very moment. And if you buy one of their terminals, you can actually tap into this system and get internet, pretty much anywhere in the world that is licensed to do so. But Starlink has proven to be such a great example of what it's like to cover space right now. And one of the things I always say is that the space industry is moving forward so rapidly and at such a clip that we really are, the rest of us are struggling to keep up. And that provides all of these really interesting ripple effects and that we get to witness in real time and that I, like space reporters like myself, get to cover. And so a great example, I like to point to Starlink because there are so many different ripple effects that come with launching this internet system. So for instance, there are thousands of satellites, Starlink satellites, in operation in orbit right now. And so one of the questions that people have been asking, and I think they're launching them pretty much every other day. It's happening quite quickly, batches them over and over. So a lot of the questions that have surfaced are, what does that mean for our orbital debris environment? The more satellites that we launch into low Earth orbit, are they going to collide more? Are there more risks of collisions? How do we traffic that? Right now, we don't actually have any kind of governing agency that is in charge of acting as a space traffic cop, right? So basically, all of these companies are really just having to coordinate with each other just because if they were to run into each other, that would create even more pieces of debris that would then threaten their other satellites. But there's no mechanism that's forcing them to do so. It's just the fact that they don't want their satellite constellations to be at risk. Another issue with Starlink that has been brought up is what does it mean for astronomy? It actually has been a point of tension between two different areas of the space beat, right? Astronomers have been actually very concerned about the growth of Starlink because satellites actually reflect light from the sun. And whenever a satellite passes in front of your telescope, if you're doing a long exposure image of the night sky, that satellite looks like a big white streak through your image. And so the more satellites that we have orbiting the Earth at any given time, the higher likelihood that your image is going to get ruined by a Starlink satellite. So there's all these different things that are happening in real time, and these are happening as SpaceX continues to inject more and more satellites into the orbital environment. So we really get to find out in within days, what does that mean? And I think that's really fun as a space reporter to cover. Another thing that we can also bring up is kind of how this is affecting our geopolitical relationships, right? So if anyone read Walter Isaacson's biography of Elon Musk, he detailed a story about the fact that, Ukraine had actually asked Elon to activate service of Starlink for a raid during their war with Russia, and he ultimately opted not to turn on that service. So that opens up all sorts of questions, right? What are the ethics of having one man being able to make that decision, someone that we haven't actually voted for or put into office? Is he allowed to have that power? What does it mean to have access to space? And should we be asking more questions about who has the ability to send things into space, and what does that mean for the rest of us? And so all of these questions you get to ask as a space reporter, and I'm definitely asking them, and I will be asking them over the next 4 years, I'm sure. So I think I've kind of made my case, but if you even need more convincing about why you should care about space, I'll leave you with this. I think these are a few things that really illustrate why it's more important than ever before to know what's going on in orbit above our heads. And, one of the basic things that a lot of people like to point to is, we are a space-based nation. The GPS in your phone uses the GPS constellations above our head all the time. You would not be able to navigate without it. So if there was some kind of, event that took out a good chunk of our satellites or our communication satellites, our GPS network, we would be SOL, if you will. Additionally, as I mentioned, NASA is a taxpayer-funded agency. And so how your dollars are spent, I think, really matters. And it's important to better understand, what the kinds of priorities that NASA is setting, the kinds of priorities that the Defense Department is setting, the Space Force. A Trump creation, that as well, it's very much in play and spending our money right as I speak. And it's important to understand where that money is going. A lot of the money is going to companies like SpaceX, Blue Origin, things like all these billionaires that have created these companies. So don't you want to know exactly how your money is being spent? And then my third point is that, space is really a crucial geopolitical tool. So one of my sources likes to tell me that, back when we started the space era, back when we were vowing to send a man to the moon, space was all about who could get there first, right? Who could we beat? How can we establish our dominance? Nowadays, space is more about who can we bring with us? Who are our allies? How can we coordinate together to achieve these really ambitious goals like sending people to the moon and to Mars? And so how we behave in space really dictates how we behave here on Earth. And the question is starting to become, if there's an event in space, if one of our adversaries were to attack one of our assets in space, could that be considered an act of war? That is something that people are actively asking right now, and I think we're getting closer for the answer to that question being yes. So I just think it's a very important beat, and as I mentioned, with the election that we just had, I think one of my sources told me, and I don't know if this is true, but I haven't fact checked it, so I'm sorry if you guys go fact check it and tell me I'm wrong, but I think it might have been the first time that space was talked about in a victory speech by a president, or a president-elect. And so I think that just goes to show that it's going to be a very big focus of these next 4 years. And so we have to be just as vigilant and on top of things as ever before. So with all that heaviness, I'll leave you on a very light note. One of the questions I get asked a lot, I get asked two questions a lot. I get asked, do I watch For All Mankind? Which I don't, unfortunately. But also, would I go to space? And I think I have one solid question, which is, how could I say no? It would be the story of a lifetime. So I really want to thank you so much. It's been so great being back here. I loved coming and get to talk to you guys about space, and I would love to answer your questions. I think we have about 10 minutes left, so feel free.
I figure I'll kick it off as a former space reporter.
Yes, perfect.
And with the question that I think everyone wants to know, when you rode the Vomit Comet, did you paint the ceiling?
I did not. Somebody else did, though, and that was a really fun moment because I got to watch the operators towel off the ceiling and the walls. It was like, when you vomit in 0G, there's no floor.
Where's the bag etiquette?
The bad, what?
The bag etiquette.
I didn't see any bags, unfortunately. We could have used them.
Other questions? Yeah, Kathleen.
Old people asking questions.
I like it.
Do I need to come up there or can you hear me?
You can, go ahead.
Yeah. So this is another question that's just kind of silly, but which sci-fi movie about NASA, when you roll your eyes and go, oh no.
Oh gosh. I hate to say Gravity. I just feel like they got some really basic physics wrong. I'm terrible to watch space movies with you guys. All I do is I just turn to the person next to me and say, oh, that would never happen. It's impossible. So you don't want to watch a space movie with me. I will say one of my favorite sci-fi movies is the movie Contact. I think that is just a spectacular film, and I really think that's a good movie that really encompasses like the awe of why we explore space and all of the questions around it and what it means for us. If you really want to go deep, I think that's the one to watch. Okay. Sure.
I have a mobility problem. So
No problem.
I just have a complaint against your presentation.
Oh. I can take it.
Lots of questions to answer, or get you to answer, and you already told me.
Well, I'm nothing if not thorough, so I guess.
Way out here. What about the situation with other countries like India and China, and how does that fit in with world politics?
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to places like India, there's a lot of countries now that are catching up to us in terms of capability, and so we are trying to actively work with them. So the Artemis program, for instance, is something that NASA is trying to use to bring in a lot more partners. Like I mentioned, it's all about who we can bring with us, and so NASA is trying to use Artemis as kind of this geopolitical tool. I mean, we have a lot of partners through that program. Europe, I don't know about India, but the European Space Agency is a big one. I think we're trying to bring in like Australia. We have this thing called the Artemis Accords, and it's actually a framework that the previous administration put together to outline rules and regulations for how we're going to explore the moon. And we have a number of countries that have signed on to that. So that is one way that we kind of bring in more countries to feel like they're involved with our space program, and that goes a long way for our allies. China, I will mention, and Russia. China has often been substituted in the place of the Soviet Union, I would say, in terms of how we talk about it in the space world. A lot of people like to point to China as the next big thing that we need to overcome. So I mentioned countries are catching up to us in terms of capability. China is rapidly catching up to us in terms of capability. They already have their own space station that they have that's permanently staffed like ours. And so they also have ambitions of sending humans to the moon as well. And so you'll see a lot of lawmakers and people at NASA too constantly evoking that, if we keep our eye off of the ball, then China's going to catch up with us and then eventually surpass us. I have my own feelings about this. I think China is often invoked to try and garner the response that we got during the Cold War and the space race, because back when we were competing with the Soviet Union to send people back to the moon, or to the moon for the first time, that was a matter of national security, because we needed to beat the Soviets. And so NASA really benefited from a large influx of funding. And I think a lot of people are trying to use China in a similar way to get the funding and the urgency that we had back then. I don't necessarily think it's working at the same level that a lot of people would like it to, but I think that's why you'll hear a lot about China as this kind of boogeyman right now, in the space world specifically, because a lot of people are worried that they're going to demonstrate these capabilities and that we won't be the dominant player in space. And like I said, there are differing opinions about that, but that is ultimately kind of how things stand, and there's a lot of concern about if they were to get to the moon, for instance, before us, could they stake a claim to it, and then push us out? Like all these kinds of hypotheticals. Obviously, we're still a long way off from that actually happening, but it's something to think about for sure. Sure.
Concerns about Musk being so close to Trump.
I won't say they're my concerns, but I will list out what questions we're asking, right? So I think one of the big questions is what does Musk get from his endorsement of Trump? And I think one of the things that we've been hearing a lot, I mentioned that regulation part of it, right? So Elon's been very open about over-regulation stifling the space industry, and so he's hopeful that Trump will deregulate a lot of things, making it easier for SpaceX and other companies to do more bold and ambitious things. We will find out if that is the case. Another thing that I think is a big one is Mars. So anyone who's followed Elon for any period of time quickly learns that his end game is to start a settlement on Mars. And so I think if you've been listening to a lot of President Trump's speeches recently, he's been talking about Mars and how we're going to go to Mars within his term. I mentioned don't take a launch date, at face value. But I think that is something that I think Elon is banking on as well. Is also, he wants to go to Mars, and so having an administration that is friendly to that could pay dividends. And that's just from the space side of things. I don't cover Tesla. I don't cover all this other stuff. I'm just a space person. So there might be other reasons, but I won't go into them. Sure.
Okay, so do you think propaganda or disinformation is something that you have to deal with in this space?
Yes, and I have to be very careful with how I say it. I won't say propaganda. I'll just say that, it's a great time to be both a reporter and a consumer of news, and it's also a hard time to be a reporter and a consumer of news, as there are just more information streams than ever before, and there are all sorts of different types of people that are, giving you the so-called news, and it's harder to differentiate between folks that might have a vested interest in providing you certain types of information and folks that are trying to kind of strip away all of those biases and those things that could be perceived as a conflict of interest. And so, yes, it's something that we're trying to work against all the time. I think it's harder for you guys, honestly. Non-journalists. I think media literacy is something that's more important than ever before. I'm happy to talk about it, but yeah, it is really tough. And so, the way that I kind of do it is I just keep doing my job, and it's harder and harder because there's more attacks on the press than ever before. But we are supposed to have a thick skin in this business. I won't say that it's not difficult. It definitely, I'm in therapy. But it's something that that you just know what you're signing up for when you do it.
One last question. You want to go, Brian, in the back?
Yeah.
Yeah, given the changing landscape and how much journalism has changed, what advice would you give to students who are looking to get into the field?
Yeah, my biggest thing is, at least when it comes to if you want to be a beat reporter, and I think this is kind of more and more how people are getting into journalism. There are still general assignment reporters, but I think beat reporting is becoming more of a focus than ever before. And that's just to really throw yourself into it. I mentioned earlier that I had this kind of naive sense that I knew everything about space when I first started because of my background, and I really didn't. And so, but I had a kind of bullish confidence that I wouldn't have anymore, and I kind of just threw myself into it, and I definitely made mistakes. You're gonna make mistakes, but the more and more that I wrote about it, the more and more comfortable I became, and that's really how I learned, on the job. And sometimes that actually comes with some downsides, right? So one thing I also have to actively work against is that the fact that I have been doing this so long, I can sometimes get into a sense of comfortability, or saying words that people don't understand but people in the industry understand, jargon, if you will. So I constantly have to check myself and make sure that I'm not too dissociated from the layperson's understanding of space. But yes, I think really just diving in and writing over and over again. It's consistency. And I know it's probably cliche to say that, but just being routine and forcing yourself to write and to follow along with the mundane details, that's really what's going to make you a great reporter.